Was an effete and effeminate Italian, which, as I say, Steve will challenge by talking about his own experiences when the annual National Trust for Scotland 1745 Association lecture is held in April. The myth has been encouraged by these well-known portraits, these very fine portraits of Prince Charlie by Antonio David, and on the top they're paired with Prince Charlie and Prince Henry and Jean-Etienne Lyotard. However, both of these portraits were printed when Prince Charles was a child, in 1729 in the case of the David portrait, and in 1735 in the case of Lyotard. At the time of the Rising of 1745, he didn't look like this. However, the representation of Prince Charles's affectless and naive youth has endured. It was sustained by William Mossman. There's the Mossman portrait up there, which many of you will be familiar with. His portrait has become one of the defining images of the prince as he supposedly appeared at the time of the Rising. It shows the prince in tartan, his bonnet decked with a white cockade, the unifying symbol of the Jacobite army. However, this portrait was not painted from life and indeed is something of a caricature. Unfortunately, this image of the prince has been reinforced by the popular TV romance Outlander. The question we must ask ourselves is this: is it really possible that the prince, as portrayed by Outlander, would really have secured the support of men as diverse as Lochiel, Lord George Murray, the Duke of Perth, Colonel John William O'Sullivan? These were experienced men, intelligent men, rational men, and they knew very well that they were risking everything by throwing in their lot with the prince. Is it really credible that they would have backed a naive, foolish, and reckless gambler? Myth number 6. The Rising of 1745 was financed by sympathetic Scottish aristocrats. Outlander presents a caricature of the prince as a drunken fop who cunningly plotted his expedition in Parisian brothels, his thought processes stimulated by copious amounts of wine and a ready supply of fetching doxies, driven by something approaching religious mania and raising funds from a shadowy group of aristocrats, principal among whom is the fictional Duke of Sandringham, played by the John Lewis of the thespian profession, never knowingly underacted, yes, Simon Callow. Ladies and gentlemen, today I can exclusively reveal the Rising of 1745 was not, in fact, financed by Simon Callow. No. The main source of funds was that lady, of whom I'll say more later, Princess Clementina Maria Sobieski, and the jewels left to him, to the prince by his mother, which are legendary Sobieski diamonds, and you can see she's wearing some of them in that portrait. He pledged these as collateral for loans raised from bankers who financed his expedition. Myth number 7, that Rising never had a chance of success. Well, that's obviously not what Lord George Murray, the Duke of Perth, and the prince's other supporters thought. And as the prince advanced onto London, it wasn't what King George thought either. He was busy loading a ship with his treasure, preparing to evacuate his family back to Hanover. And it wasn't what the ordinary citizens of London thought in early December 1745, when there was a run on the banks as they desperately sought to withdraw their gold and panic swept the city. But then, with London wide open before them, on December the 5th, the fateful Council of War was held at Derby, and against the desperate entreaties of Prince Charlie to continue the advance, the Jacobite High Command instead decided to retreat based on false intelligence that there was a great army barring their way to London. Had they instead continued the advance, their chances of success must be rated as at least 50-50. And in my view, there are many lessons to be learned from the Rising of 1745. But one of the most important is that once you've decided on a strategy, your best course of action is to stick with it. If you lose your nerve and abandon it halfway through, like the Jacobites did at Derby, the outcome is likely to be disastrous. As the Gallic lament goes, Chan boad ach baz, van dan ruin. Not victory, but death was our destiny. So we're all facing the wrong way, but if you turn around, you'll see Allan Ramsay's portrait of Prince Charles, which is the only known portrait of the Prince painted here in Edinburgh, in Scotland, in October of 1745. There's a myth that this portrait was commissioned by Prince Charlie's valet. We now know what Prince Charles would have looked like at the time of the Rising, and he would have looked very much like this representation of him, which was acquired by the Scottish National Portrait Gallery from the Earl of Wemyss in 2016 through the acceptance in lieu scheme for the princely sum of £1.12 million. So that wee portrait has a valuation of well over £1 million. Why? Because it was painted while the Prince was here in Edinburgh in 1745 and was the only known portrait of him painted from life in Britain. But there are a couple of misconceptions about it. The first is that the instruction to Allan Ramsay came from someone named John Stewart, described by the gallery as Prince Charles's valet. The person who commissioned that portrait was not Prince Charles's valet. It was Colonel John Roy Stewart, who was a leading Jacobite officer, a commander of the Edinburgh Regiment, one of the Prince's closest allies, and an important Gaelic bard, a figure whom we in the 1745 Association consider to be of such significance that we erected a cairn to serve as a permanent memorial to him in his native Strathspey in 1998. Myth number 9, Ramsay painted the Prince's portrait in October 1745. Now, this is a slight curveball. My case is not that Allan Ramsay did not execute his work in October 1745, but rather it was never intended to be a finished portrait of the Prince. In his book, The 45, Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Untold Story of the Jacobite Rising, my immediate predecessor as chairman of the 1745 Association, Dr. Christopher Duffy, wrote that towards the end of October 1745, Colonel John Roy Stewart summoned Allan Ramsay to make a portrait of Prince Charles at Holyrood House. This work could hardly have progressed beyond the preliminary sketches before the sittings were interrupted. Page 207. This book was published in 2004, so it was before that portrait had come to light. But I spoke to Christopher about his analysis, and I told him, and I think he broadly agreed, that his description of the work as a preliminary sketch could be quite close to the truth. This painting could be a preparatory study intended to give the Prince an idea of Ramsay's conception for a larger portrait. Myth number 10. The decision was taken that Scotland would attack England at the Council of War on October 30th, 1745. So, back in 2014, we had the idea of recreating the Council of War held at Holyrood Palace on October 30th, 1745, when the Jacobite High Command decided by a single vote to advance into England. We thought such an event might help to increase understanding of a cathartic moment in British history, with speakers invited to put each side of the case. On the one hand, the case made by the Prince to advance onto London. On the other hand, the opposing case put by Lord George Murray and the clan chieftains that a better option was to consolidate support here in Scotland, wage a defensive war, and keep the redcoats off them until reinforcements arrived from France. The trustees of Holyrood, historic royal palaces, came back with a response, and I quote, that they could not give approval to an event that would commemorate Scotland attacking England in the year of the independence referendum. So that put a kibosh on my plan. For the benefit of historic royal palaces, I'd just like to point out that the Rising of 1745 was not Scotland attacking England. It was a dynastic struggle between the House of Stuart and the House of Hanover. Myth number 11, Bonnie Prince Charlie abandoned Scotland after Culloden. This is pure Hanoverian propaganda, and we have first-hand evidence to prove it. A memorandum written by Prince Charlie to the King of France in November 1746, immediately after his escape from Scotland, in which he appeals to the King for support to enable him to go back and finish the job. I acquired this memorandum from the heirs of the Marquis d'Argenson, who was King Louis XV's Minister for War, several years ago, and sold it in 2014 when it was acquired by the National Trust for Scotland. I believe it's now at Culloden. And Bob's predecessor as editor, Brian Whiting, said, well, thank goodness it's been secured by a national collection, it shouldn't really be hidden away in some private collector's cellar. I kept a straight poker face at this remark because as a matter of fact, I knew that's exactly where it had been for the previous 15 years. In fact, I'm only grateful that my wife didn't throw it out in one of her spring cleans. Written in French, it gives the prince's account in his own hand of the rising, and he says it very nearly succeeded. He wrote, and I quote, "I never lacked Scottish subjects ready to fight. What I did simultaneously lack was money, supplies, and a handful of regular troops. With but one of these, I would today still be master of Scotland and probably the whole of England." He concludes that these setbacks can still be redressed, and if the king can only see his way to confer on him a corps of 20,000 regular troops, he'll go back to finish the job. Now, granted, this memorandum reveals a certain characteristic over-optimism on the part of the Bonnie Prince, but it's also testimony in his own hand that proves beyond doubt that he did not abandon Scotland. He saw himself more like his great-uncle Charles II, who lost a battle, the Battle of Worcester, but then restored the Stuart dynasty when he returned in triumph after the fall of the Cromwellian Parliament. It's only in retrospect today that people say the prince abandoned Scotland when he boarded the Hereur on September 20th, 1746. It's very clear from the memorandum the prince didn't see it that way at all at the time. Myth number 12. Prince Charlie's younger brother, Prince Henry, had his portrait painted by Quentin de la Tour in 1747 in an act of ironic regret at the failure of the rising. The La Tour portrait is a very important portrait. It used to hang over there. I don't know if you given, hopefully everyone's got a wee postcard of it, or every couple. Anyone care to guess, hazard a guess where that portrait is now? Well, I'm sorry to say that the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, in its wisdom, has decided the best place for it is hidden from public view in a cupboard in Granton, in a Granton storage facility. The gallery acquired the La Tour portrait in 1994 and for many years believed it was a painting of Prince Charles Edward Stuart, so a bit embarrassed when in 2009 art historian Dr. Benda Grosvenor demonstrated that it was in fact a portrait of his younger brother Prince Henry. So that was embarrassment number one. Number two, the SNPG then dated this portrait as 1746 or 1747 and described it as an ironic portrayal of Henry commissioned after the rising had failed. This just doesn't make any sense. It couldn't have been painted after July 1747. That was the month Prince Henry was ordained as a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church. And in fact, he went on to be a cardinal for more than 60 years and was by far the longest serving cardinal in the history of the Roman Catholic Church. And it seems rather unlikely that Cardinal York, as he then was, would have got his portrait painted as a warrior dressed up in armour, either after or during the months leading up to his ordination as a cardinal, which brings us back to 1746. Is it really credible that Prince Henry would have commissioned such a portrait in the aftermath of Culloden, with his brother on the run and under threat of his life? And Prince Henry, we know, was very concerned about his brother's welfare at this time, as you'd expect him to be. I submit there's nothing we know of the character of Prince Henry that suggests that he would be capable of such an insensitive or even callous act, which led me to conclude that that portrait was painted during the rising and not afterwards, and the SNPG's interpretation was completely and utterly wrong. Maurice Quentin de la Tour had his studio in Paris, and we can place Prince Henry in Paris in late 1745, when he was granted an audience by King Louis, with whom he signed the Treaty of Fontainebleau on October 24th, 1745, under which King Louis pledged French support to the Jacobite army, committing 11,000 French troops under the titular command of Prince Henry. So what better way to celebrate the signature of that treaty than by getting your portrait painted by a well-known artist? So the most likely date when Henry had his portrait painted by La Tour is November 1745, as he waited in Paris for the French forces to mobilize under his command. This dating of the La Tour portrait is supported by evidence submitted by Association member Joyce Mackenzie. After I advanced my theory, she said, "It certainly seems plausible, even probable, that Henry sat for the portrait in 1745. Henry's social connections in Paris in late 1745 connect him to La Tour. He was living in a house loaned to him by the Princess de Conti. Her brother, the Comte de Clermont, was painted by Latour earlier that year, unquote. This dating is also supported by pastel expert Neil Jaffares, who writes that, and I quote, "The portrait was likely to have been made after Henry's arrival in Paris, shortly after the victory at Prestonpans in September 1745, while Henry was trying to raise support for the Jacobite rebellion, but before his departure for Boulogne in December 1745. Why this is so important is that it means the Latour portrait was painted not in commemoration of the failure of the Rising of 1745, but rather in anticipation of its imminent success. And that is what makes this painting one of the most important and most poignant Jacobite portraits of all, and such a shame that the SNPG in its wisdom have chosen to hide it from public view in a cupboard in Granton. That's more or less the end of part two. I've got one more critique of the SNPG, but it's tucked away there, and then we'll come to part three. This is a Harlequin portrait of Prince Charlie, which is described as a work of pro-Jacobite propaganda, just here. I don't think it's a work of pro-Jacobite propaganda at all. If an artist dresses up Prince Charlie as a Harlequin, as he is there, a trickster and a figure of fun in Italian comedy, it seems more likely he's trying to bury the prince rather than to praise him. The artist is one James Worsdale, who's just, and I've looked up some references for James Worsdale in a book entitled Libertines and Harlots from 1600 to 1836, which, as its title suggests, is a work of serious and important scholarship. James Worsdale, this erudite volume informs us, was one of the founding members of the Dublin and Limerick Hellfire Clubs and quickly became Master of Rebels in the Dublin Club, where his functions included the supply of ladies of easy virtue for orgies at the Eagle Tavern, which I must look up next time I'm in Dublin. The account goes on to relate that Worsdale moved frequently between Ireland and England on so-called business, and while in London, teamed up with various actors, writers, and other ne'er-do-wells to trawl the taverns and brothels of Drury Lane, a melting pot for pickpockets, crooked lawyers, pimps, tarts, and other unsavoury characters. By the way, I must apologise to any pimps or tarts here today for bracketing them with lawyers, but it's not me that's saying this. This is from Libertines and Harlots reference book. Just wanted to make that clear. Worsdale painted the Harlequin portrait of Bonnie Prince Charlie in 1745, and in his will left £200 each to his 5 acknowledged illegitimate children, all to different mothers, from which we learn that Mr. Worsdale was a warm-hearted and generous chap to all in many different ways. But he doesn't sound like the kind of individual who would risk his neck in the Jacobite cause. He sounds more like a Grub Street hack, churning out catchpenny prints, mocking Prince Charlie, to cash in on live public interest as the Highland Army advanced on London, to supplement his income from various other sources and curry favour with the Hanoverians in the hope that they might turn a blind eye to some of his other nefarious enterprises. So that's my interpretation of this portrait.